when we look at confronting the climate crisis, the obstacles are enormous, the challenge is unbelievable, and the time is short. We're literally in a race against time to reinvent our world. And I know you know that. That's why we're here this week. And while we spent a lot of time talking about the technologies and the entrepreneurs and the companies behind all of this, it's also about changing hearts and minds and ultimately culture. So how do you do that? What does that even mean? We're going to have a conversation about that now across continents and across generations. Joining me from London is Clover Hogan, the CEO of Force of Nature, which is an organization that works with young people to turn eco-anxiety into eco-action. And joining me from Dubai, entrepreneur and writer Mogadot, who is the author of the book Solve for Happy. We'll get a little bit more into that story. In fact, Mo, let's start with you. You have been an entrepreneur. You worked in the tech world here in the Valley. You were the chief business officer for Google X, which is the Google's moonshot factory. You had all the success and that anyone can imagine, and yet you weren't so happy, and you left, and you ultimately transitioned or pivoted your career trajectory to look at the world of happiness, individually and collectively. So just to start, what does it mean to change? What is the role of culture change in confronting the climate crisis?
First of all, thank you all for having me. I hope that we can give you a slightly different view today. I am a typical example of someone who has followed the lie for very long, and then eventually ended up realizing that despite the fact that I've contributed to inventing amazing things that I thought changed the world, the result was that they changed the world positively sometimes and negatively sometimes, and we never even stopped to look back at what we did to recognize that maybe some of what we're creating today is not what we need. And when you look at climate change as a challenge ahead of all of us, you can get stuck into the details. You can go and say, this use of technology or this use of that fuel or that company or this country is causing more damage to the climate than another. But if you really take a helicopter view and go to the top view of what's going on, you would recognize that the reason for everything that we have in our world today in terms of climate change is our greedy consumerism. It's us wanting more and more and more of what we don't need and ignoring the fact that our capitalist greed, as we go around our planet harvesting its resources and wasting and polluting, we're getting what we need for short-term gratification while we are killing our long-term well-being and the future of our children. And I think the reality of the matter is that if we stop for a second, we would realize that what we need is not what's offered to us anymore. Now, I don't mean to say that capitalism is a bad thing in any way. I think the challenge with capitalism is that we have set the wrong target for capitalism. Capitalism as a process is an incredible way to improve things, but if the target is not dollars, when I set myself the mission of 1 billion happy, I want to become a billionaire, but not with $1 billion. I want to become a billionaire with 1 billion happy people. A lot of us, when we look at our own behaviors, the way we are when we think about contributing to slowing down the climate change by buying a new car that has a better fuel economy or an electric car, or the reality is what we need to do is to stop the mileage, to slow it down, to not consume what we don't need. We don't need another iPhone to brag with. We need to save our planet. We don't need 1 million pictures on our cloud storage that uses data systems that keep humming away. We need to stop. We need to change our own culture. The planet does not need fixing. That's what everybody forgets. It just needs to be for us to stop killing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah. So Clover, talk about culture change from your perspective, and you're working with youth culture in particular. What does that mean? What does that look like?
So I think As was in fact demonstrated by a number of the climate pitches we heard before this session, it's really easy to be convinced that techno-utopianism will save us from the climate crisis, or worse yet, that the climate crisis is just one giant business opportunity to Mo's point, or to believe that we can, geoengineer ourselves out of this mess rather than going to the heart of the crisis. But for me, the reality is that we are, so fixated on being above the rest of planetary life that our solutions to the climate crisis are to really double down on this divorce. And as Mo highlighted, we have a society today that is predicated on limitless growth with finite resources and promoting values like competition and consumption over connection and community. And what that means is that in today's society, it is easier to envisage life on a terraformed Mars than it is to forge meaningful relationships with life here on Earth. So when we're talking about culture change, we're talking about the fact that the biggest changes that need to happen are in fact a mindset. We've had the technology, resources, human ingenuity to solve this crisis for decades, in fact, decades longer than I've been on this planet. And critically, what we need is the cultural shift.
Right. So, Mo, you're talking about consumption, over-reliance on consumption. Clover, you're talking about over-reliance on technology. So that's kind of the story we've been told, including by many of the companies in this room and watching this. So how do we change that story? What is the story we need to be talking about, Clover?
So I think today's mainstream culture pretty much does everything it can to convince us that everything's fine, everything's going to be okay, even as the science tells us objectively that we are hurtling toward a cliff of climate collapse. So the first thing that needs to happen by way of culture change is to address that the climate emergency is an emergency. Ergo, it demands an emergency type response. And then, of course, we need to actually understand how power works. The fossil fuel industry has done, again, a really good job of convincing us that it's up to individuals. So long as we just turn off the lights when we leave a room or buy a reusable coffee cup, then we'll solve the problem. And yet 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. A handful of companies are responsible for the mass deforestation of Borneo and the Amazon. A handful of companies are responsible for plastic pollution in places like the Philippines and Indonesia. So today we need to demand nothing short of system change, and we need to do so knowing that power does not want to disrupt itself. The people, including the fossil fuel industry, who continue to profit off this deeply broken system are not going to bring that change upon themselves. And that's where people power, coming together, galvanizing action in our communities, inside and outside of the system, is so important to push forward that change. Yeah.
So Mo, you're a gifted storyteller. Talk a little bit about the story that you think we should be telling and how we collectively make that a collective story that ultimately leads to collective action.
I think Clover summarizes it very well. I think the idea of us taking a stand honestly goes way beyond throwing mashed potatoes on the works of arts and protesting in the streets. We vote within a system that's built on economics with our economic power. It's as simple as that. It is by not participating in the cycle that is propagating this damage to our planet that those companies will take a stand. When we put enough pressure on BP so goes out to say, okay, we have a vision 2050 and we're going to be net zero by 2050. Maybe more pressure will make it closer than 2050. And the idea here is, can we as humans in every single one of our actions, from buying apples that are wrapped in plastic in the supermarket all the way to your biggest investment decisions, can we vote with our decisions by saying we're not going to participate in an economy that's going to destroy our future and the future of our children?
Yeah. So Clover, how does this sound different perhaps generationally? How is there a different story for those who are just really starting their lives and careers and families versus my generation, which is looking at the well beyond the back half of that? So what is that story like? Is it different than, say, Mo's story?
Yeah, so I think we have to start again by asking ourselves who is currently in power in business and policy, and again, who benefits from the system staying the same. And the reality is, right now, it's older people, right? Even as a young person, I can't vote until the age of 18, and chances are, if I go to the polls, I'm asked to choose between a climate change denier and a seasoned procrastinator. So young people, this generation, who are going to inherit the worst impacts of the climate crisis, are being excluded from the decisions that are governing our future. So we need to start by challenging that historic power imbalance, and we need to understand that we are not going to solve this crisis with the same people and the same thinking that created it. One of the most powerful moves that I'm seeing at the moment when we talk to people in positions of power is that they're not taking action because they've read an IPCC report or because they went to COP, but because their kids came home to them at the end of the day and asked, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about the climate crisis? So at the heart of this is a shift of historic generational power and ensuring, again, that those inheriting the worst impacts have a seat at the table.
So, Mo, is that the kind of story that you think will resonate also for older generations?
Well, I have to admit I am to blame. I mean, I'm with my blind, folded eyes running through the capitalist economies for so long, like everyone else. Yes, of course. When we're older, we have more money, we buy more toys, we damage more, we build bigger companies that damage more. And the reality is, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, "Okay, let me invent something that's going to destroy the world today." People wake up in the morning and say, where are my benefits as per the current setup that has set me profit and dollars as my only target? And so accordingly, to push the older generation, the younger generation needs to say, okay, we're not buying your products until you start to have an agenda that's favoring our future.
Yeah. So this conversation that we're having so far is, I'll just say it, it's a fairly privileged conversation. We're talking about stuff, consumption, clearly talking about people who have, as opposed to the overwhelming number of people who don't. What's the story that in which they need to be engaged, what is the story that we need to be engaged in together so that we are all, literally and figuratively on the same page when it comes to understanding both the threats and the opportunities before us? Mo, I'll let you start.
Well, I think the reality of the matter is, if you look at the stats, these are the ones that are suffering from the consumption of the more advanced, more privileged. The world where per capita consumption, per capita miles driven, per capita trips to go surfing is much lower, is not really the big reason. Even though they are the largest number of humans on the planet, they are the ones at the bottom end of this chain where the damage is getting to them while they're not even enjoying the indulgence that is causing it in the first place. And so in reality, you can easily imagine that there will be a point in time where this world will become angry, will become unaccepting of what's, how the divergence between the two worlds is leading to damage on one side without the indulgence, and indulgence on the other side with no care for the damage.
So, Clover, I know your Force of Nature is a global organization. I'm guessing you have young people from all over the world. What are you hearing from those from the more marginalized communities and developing economies around how we all come together on climate?
Yeah, so I think it's really tempting to talk about the climate crisis as if it's something that is going to be happening in 2050. We've had the stats. We're on track for 1 billion climate migrants by 2050. We're on track for 90% of coral reefs dying. But the climate crisis is already happening, right? And the people who have contributed least to this crisis are the ones who are now experiencing its worst impacts. In Pakistan, we saw over 33 million people displaced. I can't even wrap my head around that number. And even though you might not have heard it in the headlines, 1.5 million people have been displaced in Nigeria, again by flooding. So the climate emergency is already here. The people who are most vulnerable, who have contributed least to the fossil fuel economy, are the ones who are paying the price. And so young people are hyper aware that the climate crisis is a crisis of justice, of human rights. And that's why it has to be a human conversation. We have to, in every conversation, particularly when we're allowing technology to enter into the equation, talk about the importance of building fair and equitable communities. And with that also comes a really compelling invitation, because set aside the climate crisis, some of the most powerful solutions for solving this problem include regenerating nature, include education for girls, include empowering women and ensuring women have their reproductive rights safeguarded. So, people have to be at the center of everything we talk about. And the great thing about this generation who have inherited the climate crisis is that we have a capacity to see outside of the incumbent system and to imagine a world that is radically different. And that's why it's so important that we don't just give young people the microphone, we ensure that they're at the heart of all of the decisions that we're making.
So really quickly, as we wind down this session and ultimately the plenary portion of this event, what's the irresistible, compelling story we need to be telling out there to the world that will just maybe change those hearts and minds finally once and for all? Clover, what do you think?
The climate crisis is the greatest threat we've ever faced, and yet it's also the biggest opportunity we've ever had to rethink so much of how we live, from the clothes we wear to the food we eat to how we get around the cities we live in, and critically what it is to be human. What is our purpose on this beautiful planet and the life we've been gifted? And so for me, it's so important that we don't just fixate on the problems we've inherited. We use this as an opportunity to really think, what is the world that we can create? And for me, that's a world where everyone has the right to clean air, everyone has the right to clean water, everyone has the right to prosperity, to live in abundance with nature, to live in abundance with community. And that could not be a more exciting invitation, because while this is the biggest challenge we've ever faced, there is no challenge more important that we could dedicate our lives to solving.
Yeah, I don't think you get any argument from this crowd. Mo, what is that, real quickly, that irresistible, compelling vision of the future that you want us to be telling?
Well, I hosted Clover on my podcast. This is how we met or got close to get to know each other. And I asked her and I said, Clover, what can we do? Is there a technology we can create, or is there something that we can do to reverse this? And she said, the technology has already been created. I was very optimistic. And she said, it's called the tree. The earth is the best technology that we have to reverse this. And the story that we have is to have to connect. Really, we need to connect back to that nature. We need to remember that this is where we come from. We're not just visitors. We are of Mother Nature. And I think the reality is, when we see it that way, everything starts to change.
Well, this is a story that we all get to write together. It's going to be a long story, a long form essay that all of us get a part of. Mo and Clover, thank you so much for your part in helping us understand what that story might be, and in the great work that you do in propagating a better vision for our planet. Please join me in thanking Clover and Mo.